Alright, so what I wanted to do was shoot a video about the phone call that I just got off of with my state's food stamp department and how the problems I'm having with them relate to American ideals of accountability and obligation, and how that relates to the callousness of the American government and the coronavirus pandemic occurring. Not only the coronavirus pandemic occurring, but specifically the virus SARS-CoV-2 even replicating within Wuhan, China, and how it should have been stopped probably in 2018. But then I lost all interest in doing that and just said, I'm going to shoot this video about Hunter x Hunter. So I'm going to tell you now, if you don't, if for whatever stupid reason you were watching this video and it happens to be that you don't know anything about that series, I will try to give a short rundown because the point of this video is to talk about fiction, like concepts in fiction, and how specifically I relate to recent decisions that were made in the last about 5 years by the author of how to approach specifically capabilities, superhuman or other supernatural capabilities in a battle shonen or an action comic of sorts. Uh, First, but I'm gonna go ahead and try to give the shortest rundown of what I can say Hunter x Hunter is about. Uh, Hunter x Hunter is an explorers club. Is a manga created by Yoshihiro Tagashi that is effectively about an explorers club of a different universe, not this world's famous American Explorers Club, but a fictional Explorers Club that is internationally effective. It is the story focuses on a young adventure boy. This is an adventure boy comic, so think like Ren Tin Tin, that kind of thing. Popeye is a bit question. Popeye could be a bit more episodic than being an adventure boy. Well, Astro Boy, that kind of thing. Those type of comics where a boy goes on an adventure. And in this comic, the boy's adventure is to join this adventurers club, primarily out of curiosity, particularly because he wants to find someone who is a member of this adventure club. And that is an inspiration to the person he's looking for, is an inspiration to him to try to join this club and figure out what it's all about. And the heavy point of what becomes what a lot of this series is about in relation to the world comes in about what could technically be considered the third or fourth arc of the story. See, the first arc of this story, probably the first and second, are quite heavily about just becoming a member of this Explorer Club, which is referred to as the Hunters Organization, because everyone in this Explorer Club hunts things around the world. By hunt, of course, it means to research and to obtain in some fashion. Some people are hunting actual things like big game. They're hunting animals. We call them like animal hunters. On the other hand, people hunt more abstract things like crime. They try to stop crime organizations or more specific matters of crime, like being a bounty hunter. Some people hunt medication or cures for things. They're medicine hunters. And then there are people who try to hunt ruins. So they'll be like archaeologists, if you will. That's just what we call them. We call them archaeologists. They're not, because ruin hunter is a stupid name. So, anyways, all these people are making these decisions, but it turns out that there is sort of a basis to being a hunter. And even before you find a specific thing that you look for, you're trying to learn the basics of being not necessarily a person who searches for specific things, but a person who is capable for exploring this world. And that is what the main characters of this work, and anyone who is involved in this or wants to be a part of this organization, is learning when they take an exam to be part of this organization. Effectively, you find out that the peak of any field in that world is not truly going to be observable. It won't be in the scope of an average person. The things that you may learn passively in public school is something that you're not going to realize the fullness of unless you're part of that field in that world. So an example would be a person wanting to be a doctor. Everything that you could possibly learn about this field from like public school, for example, you just have to know that there's a bigger world of higher learning out there. And then if you did go to college and you try to really go to college and beyond that career, really excel in the world of medicine, effectively what this manga would say, what this fiction would point out to you is you're still not at the peak. The peak is things that most of us will never be able to examine. And in some fashion, that is going to involve you going beyond the standard of the human condition. So whatever you're looking for, if you're searching for cures, if you're searching for elusive people, if you're searching for ancient things that like most archaeologists will never find, chances are your best chance at being at the peak of your field is to condition your mind and body beyond the standard of what a human will do. Now, the explanation that is presented in this world for this is that most people don't understand what the peak of human conditioning is. And that much like in our world, at least like how things have been in the past, in our world in past centuries, is that we explain things very passively in a fashion that we can't understand. We sum a lot of it up to the supernatural. The explanation is something that doesn't require a lot of explanation. It requires a lot of faith in simply believing in things like psychics and shaman and people who never have to explain why or how they do the things they do. They just do things that are beyond human capability. In this work of fiction, it's presented as though the people who consider themselves psychics and the people who dabble in the supernatural are people who are not telling the truth about what humans can do. And that the real explanation of what humans are highly capable of, spoiler, stop this video now if you ever give a damn about watching this work and you haven't already seen up to this point. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, is manipulation of the human aura, referred to, and this type of manipulation is a school of thought referred to as Nin. It's a lot like Eastern concepts that you would present of how auras work and how they're usually stylized in fiction. Like whenever you refer to something like, we think like the peak of that stylization, or we think that like the worst you'll see of this stylization is stuff like the work Naruto and how they refer to chakra and so forth. There's a lot of energy forms of there's a lot of energy issues when it comes to like Japanese fiction and comics and what's called shonen comics. But the reality is pretty much anything that is referring to ki is going to refer to it in an inappropriate way. I like that the YouTuber Ranton had a commentary talking about the Jackie Chan Karate Kid movie and how when it comes down to Shaolin martial arts and what people ever hear in fiction about chi, what they're getting is a long, like I want to say thousands of years, like probably 4,000 years of stylization of a basic concept of breathing. That what a lot of people are referring to as a flowing of energy through the body is a romanticized retelling of how the human body moves oxygen, how you're controlling your breathing. That is what chi actually is the study of effective breathing. So in this world, though, the discussion of aura, a type of energy that is just flowing through the person, a person manipulates it. And they do things with it. They learn how to manifest facets of their world through the way that they manipulate the aura and their being. What I think was really cool about what eventually happened, and by the way, like the point of this is to explain how all these supernatural people, these psychics and so forth, seem to do things that we can't understand. Is because they know how to manipulate aura. So it's really a matter of ignorance on part of the average person and not knowing what the human body is capable of, rather than a matter of than a person actually manipulating the supernatural. It's just people not understanding what normal humans are capable of. So the thing that I found really interesting about what this author proceeds to do later in this series. The peak of the point of discussing Nin well enough in the series to set the plot better does happen relatively early on in the series. It's somewhere the shortly after what is called the exam arc, when people don't know about Nin. It's just people learning how to be explorers. And once we get into a place where we understand how powerful Nin can actually be, and why we really don't want the public knowing about it because of how dangerous it is, there hits a point where we're trying to drive home the idea that Nin is not commonplace. If you see a person using Nin, you should acknowledge that this person is very disciplined, like more so than the average person at least, and potentially very dangerous, because that takes a lot of will, and people with a lot of will, depending on how they use it, can be very dangerous. But that kind of work, that kind of behavior in fiction, we have to acknowledge, only goes so far when you're trying to build worlds. That goes so far when you're focusing on a few people. And that's an ambitious behavior. A lot of times the argument for a work like that would be, well, maybe you need to just be focusing on a few people and just building stories from that, instead of trying to build your world further and further till the point that you can't really control it or keep up with it. I do agree with that in relation to balance, but I will also say that the places where you write up these stories should not just be focused on the potential. The potential is for the fans. The potential is for the fan fiction. The potential is for us to observe, but not expect to see in stories, because if you're just presenting potential and saying that's where you're supposed to go next instead of doing new things, you're just drawing out a franchise. Like, for example, that's the problem we could feel comes with the franchise Dragon Ball, is that instead of focusing on the really good characters we have, we'll always add new, stronger characters that make the old characters obsolete. That is true. But in an attempt to focus on older characters, not just bringing them back, but trying to keep the story locked down to the original characters, we also run the risk. Sorry, one sec. Sorry about that. So, what I was saying is, say for example in the Dragon Ball franchise, and this ain't the greatest example because Dragon Ball is an example of where you should be utilizing older characters, and he doesn't. Akira Toriyama does not always utilize a lot of these old good characters. He's always just making a new powerful threat as an antagonist. It's a very silly work. But the thing that the problem with that potentially is that you can oversaturate the characters that you already have. Like, yeah, I'll admit, a character like Krillin is horribly underutilized. He definitely should have been used more. Many of these older characters should have been used more. But hypothetically, in a world where they were, it feels like a complaint that can continue forever. Because if Krillin was well utilized in a given story, the problem will be that people aren't satisfied with the way that character was utilized in that story, and they'll just want to talk about other ways they could have been. And then you want another story immediately where Krillin is utilized in this fashion. And it goes on and on until our stories become stagnant. They become repetitive, and any of them characters can end up like the character Son Goku, who just shows up too damn much. And honestly, I mean, the place where you expect to see this most is a place like fighting games. That does happen in fighting games, and that's a place where it shouldn't. See, I want to say being able to just reutilize things works fine in fighting games if you can continue to grow your roster. But if your roster's getting too big from the same characters that have been on a roster for like 30 damn years, like Street Fighter, you find it difficult to regularly come in with new things. And often that just becomes an issue from people who have poor taste. No accountability for taste. Hey, we're talking about accountability here. No accountability for taste among audiences that just want to be pacified. They want to see the same thing over and over again. They need familiarity or they don't feel comfortable. It's gross, but what are you going to do? So, Yeah, we don't want that stagnation. And I think what does work in a work like Hunter x Hunter is that with that open world thing, if the audience truly appreciates it, they don't need to see all of the stories played out. They don't need to see all the potential stories played out. The potential in Hunter x Hunter is the fan fiction. I know I don't want to read most anybody's Hunter x Hunter fan fiction. I don't think it would be good, but I do like that that people are encouraged to make it. I like that it is an ideal work to encourage people to try writing within the game parameters of this world. I appreciate that. What I like about the direction that Hunter x Hunter has taken, though, is that in time, in order to grow that roster of characters who are significant to the matter of Nin, to grow a situation where people, the kind of situation that honestly audiences want to see, the reason why we watch super powered works of fiction, Western fiction, things like X-Men, where a large population of the world, still a minority, but a large population, is a series of mutant people with superhuman capabilities. We want to see that disaster. We want to see the conflict that comes from everyday people becoming something more than everyday people. It's the same thing we look at in Hirohiko Araki's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's a behavior that arose in that work by switching from the third story of that into the fourth one. In the third story of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and we kind of see in the third one too, we do come across the concept of a stand. It's psycho power, it's psychic abilities, kind of the same things going on in Hunter x Hunter. Honestly, a lot of the stuff that came from Hunter x Hunter was heavily inspired, very likely, by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Because the work prior to Hunter x Hunter, Yu Yu Hakusho, entered an ability that was kind of a predecessor to Nin, that was based quite heavily off of the abilities from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's a very influential work. I've been tearing up green like kale greens this entire time. So the thing to keep in mind about the abilities in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is when it starts, and the arc about these new abilities called stands, these psycho powers, people are presented as special. They're people who would often be associated with something like shamans, like rare human beings who have seemed to have access to superhuman capabilities because of their discipline, their meditative capabilities, studying their own body, developing themselves over some period of time. Whereas as you see throughout 3, because of the acts of a villain, and going into 4, there are people who are encouraging a bypassing of this to create new type of people. They use an object, an arrow, to increase the numbers of characters that you'll see presenting these behaviors. This is the same thing that I appreciate eventually is done in Hunter x Hunter. One of the main things I appreciate about that being done in fiction in the first place is that often I want to see these things done in a modern fiction. The thing about a realistic approach, an attempt at a realistic approach for something like Hunter x Hunter, is that when you look at something like the abilities of Nin, you're trying to place it first and foremost in the capabilities of human development. They present it as you see through the eyes of these 2 children in this work, as something that people develop through typically years of personal discipline and development. You're training your body, you're training your mind, you are meditating, you are exercising, you are trying to feel what is a development of aura within your body and learning how to manipulate it. You are studying something that is not common to people, partially because people are hiding this fact, but also because it's just not something that most people are ever going to develop in their lives. Typically, no matter how hard they train, you can go to the gym every damn day, you're probably not going to do it for enough years to really become something beyond, like work at the peak of your capabilities for enough years to actually find something beyond the standard of your field. And this is presented in what is considered the first user of Nin, and how he didn't reach this point until he was 40 years old after training in martial arts for, I want to say, the last 20 years, I think they were saying. And even the people he showed off in front of were also like very well trained martial artists, and a martial artist master, an old man who had never seen anything like this before. It comes down to a lot of matters of capability and effort. And in that world, we're talking about legendary effort. The things that you often saw in martial art movies, like old men who are for some reason like 300 years old training in an art form that is showing us the peak of human capability. And the times that you're seeing a young person do this in this work, they're considered as prodigies. That's what gives you the diversity at first in the work of Hunter x Hunter, is that among the people who can learn Nin, if they are not people who are particularly soldiers or students of martial arts, they're typically not going to know Nin unless something odd or supernatural has happened to them, like they've been cursed or something, or blessed in some fashion. Maybe they found some other way to work around Nin, like just to develop their mind in some fashion because of the things that they study. But typically, it was that one of those characters is a prodigy. They're just a strange example of someone being able to learn this from being a kid or taking a shortcut. There's explanation of that too in this work, of how a person could take a shortcut to unlock the aura of their being. So the places where that would get stagnant is where everyone is going to be the same character. They're going to be a grizzled soldier. But you don't want to see that in anime. We see that from, we see that we don't want to see that from examples like the word Street Fighter. We want to see people fighting in the street. Eventually, we did want to see people with powers, but those people who had powers were also interesting. Just like in Hunter x Hunter, you see a person, you see a ninja character that does not come across as the way we'd like to see a ninja intuitively, or at least in a fashion that makes sense. We see a character as a ninja in the way we would ideally like to see a character that's interesting to watch, which is a young person who behaves like us and relates to us in many fashions, that has a lot of our vernacular, that has our social problems, but still has all the discipline of someone who's been studying this shit their entire life. So yeah, we like to see characters that are relatable to us, but are clearly beyond the scope of anything we're going to do in our lifetimes. And that's kind of hard to develop realistically in a work like that unless you use certain plot elements. What has been done in the latter part of Hunter x Hunter, after we established traditionally how this worked, is we started creating more science fiction heavy arcs. Towards the end of this series, what the writer was doing was presenting the disastrous potential situation, the disastrous scenario of a bunch of people, or otherwise, like anything developing the ability to use Nin that wasn't supposed to have it, or at least nowhere near as much. And that became a problem because it was very fast. It was like, instead, what would you do if people were just born with Nin in an excessive amount, instead of having to train as a great equalizer? And beyond that, we've gone back to matters of people who are not necessarily born this way, but a question of whether or not you found yet another shortcut to put Nin and supernatural ability in the hands of people, normal people like you and I, who have not been disciplined for something and have our own ideals that have not been molded by a disciplined life, being given a gun, just being given dangerous power, given a nuke, just given horrible power that no individual should have, and now seeing what they're going to do with it. I think the reason I relate to it so heavily is because when I think about writing a fiction like that, I always question on my own part whether or not it would be a good idea to try to utilize more science fiction behaviors in a battle shonen. And I feel like there's some validation in that when I could say, yeah, if I'm setting this in the future, I want to be able to do things that don't necessarily, I want to be able to level that playing field of people who have supernatural abilities with things we already understand technologically. Like, yeah, you got your works that use genjutsus and illusion behaviors and so forth, but we're not that far as a species from holograms. I feel like holograms could be heavily utilized in a futurist work. I feel like I really need to know the entirety of the work of Ghost in the Shell, because there's a lot of behaviors there. They're just, I mean, a lot of our futurist science fiction works are cautionary tales, our Asimovian cautionary tales should be observed, like Minority Report, things like the iRobots and what have you. All of these, Total Recall, I guess. Any of uh, any of these works and the behaviors they demonstrate are ripe for action, and I feel like even it reminds me of um, that one manga Magi, and how later on in that you realize how the power scaling works in that world, and that the concept of magic and the supernatural capabilities are not as devastating as you'd like to think they are. They're only devastating to people who don't understand them. But we find out really quick, the power of someone just generating fire is typically no more powerful, if not weaker, than someone just igniting an incendiary device like that. That was very jarring for me to see in any work of fiction. Like, wow, that fireball is apparently not as devastating as a grenade. It's just devastating to people in a time when grenades did not exist. Like, guns are still really effective in anime, it turns out. So, yeah, depending on what the work is that you're watching. So, yeah, I really appreciate what was done in the latter part of Hunter x Hunter, and that idea that like we can move this fiction forward by first presenting how rare Nin is supposed to be, and then presenting a realistic situation of what if people fell into these abilities from circumstance.